I don't object to being called a founding father because I feel most of them more like these dinosaur fossil. So I didn't mind that at all. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to this group. It's a great honor. I repay the honor by saying that I'm going to be talking about the obvious. That is, I'm going to talk about who the modern scientist is, and just a little bit at the end about the possible future of the identity of the modern scientist. Now, the subject is obvious for a number of reasons. First of all, you all know who the modern scientist is. There are lots of these sorts of people around. They do jobs of work in all sorts of institutions and not just in universities. You and people like you probably know some. I was once one myself, and I suspect in this group there are people who also were at one time scientists, and maybe some who still are. So the scientist is quite a normal feature of modern society and culture. There's nothing very exotic going on when we talk about the modern scientist, though these people may be to a degree respected, valued, or disrespected and devalued. They are, if not like you and me, then they're like lots of other sorts of people doing other sorts of work in society. Now that's the obvious set of circumstances I want to discuss, though I also want to find some ways of making the obvious unobvious and self-evident contingent. So I'm an historian, and one way I can do that would be to spend a lot of time talking about the historical past and about the timing of and the causes of changes in the science's identity over time. But you'll be pleased to know that I'll do that only as the briefest preface, and that I'll spend most of my time talking about the 20th century and later developments, a little bit like the present. And the second way of making the obvious, if not unobvious, at least interesting, is to talk about some cultural consequences of thinking about and indeed managing scientists as we now do. So I'll first just list some characteristics attributed to scientists in the past, say from about the 17th century through much of the 19th century. And I'm not going to worry very much about the invention of the word in English scientist in about 1840, or about equivalent terminology in other languages. I'll let that pass. And I'll use the word scientist to refer to a heterogeneous set of people who inquire systematically into states of affairs in nature. Now, the first historical state of affairs concerns, if you like, demography. There weren't very many scientists about, and very few of them were employed remuneratively to do scientific research in the past. So, for example, the most famous scientist of the 19th century undoubtedly was Charles Darwin, and he was an amateur. He never received money to do scientific work in his life. He was what's called in English a coupon clipper, living on independent means and investments, for example, in South American railways. And Albert Einstein's seminal papers of 1906 were written when he was not paid to do this sort of thing. And Max Weber's 1917 Science as a Vocation cautioned that this was an occupation, science, ein Beruf, which usually led nowhere or to relative poverty. He cautioned his audience to think twice about taking up Wissenschaft as a career. Secondly, insofar as the figure of the scientist was reflected on or thought about in the wider culture, he, and you'll excuse me, almost always he, in the period I'm talking about, was, since the Romantic era, assimilated to the category of genius. In fact, you could say this goes back much further to the Christian past with the idea of inspiration. So it's cognitively a special sort of person. scientific discovery, like poetic or musical creativity, was the capacity of extraordinary sorts of people with extraordinary minds. Newton, the question was asked, was he as other men? Similar questions were asked about Albert Einstein, and the genre actually persists. But whatever the capacity of these extraordinary mental capacity was not considered to be the sort of thing that you could acquire through hard work and practice. Now, there was an alternative conception, and especially going back to the 17th century, getting stronger through the 18th and 19th century. There was an alternative conception of the scientific mind which sat alongside that of genius, and that was the notion that there was an effective, clear, formalized, and universally applicable scientific method, which, if you learnt it, could mechanically yield new knowledge. So that was essentially a democratic conception as opposed to the conception of genius. But the method was represented as quite different from methods employed in other sorts of intellectual practices, and it might be very hard to acquire and very hard to apply in a systematic and rigorous way. Third, and relatedly, again in the past, it was widely perceived that the scientist was morally extraordinary, more honest, more fair-minded, more open-minded, less prejudiced. Those who possessed scientific knowledge and method were more able to make virtuous ethical, social, and political decisions. And so the idea of the philosopher king and the regrets, especially strongly in the early part of the 20th century, that the scientific method was not more widely applied to solve social and political problems. But it was thought that part of the moral superiority of the scientist was someone who needed, like the ancient philosopher, less of the world's material goods. The scientist was indifferent to ordinary conventions. And the scientist in this scheme of things was definitely not the engineer or technologist. And what the scientist did was done without expectation of commercial or useful outcomes. That was someone else's job. So in Max Weber's formulation, again in Wissenschaft als Beruf, the scientist was a kind of moral hero just because the scientist met a meaningless world with passion, living a moral life in a world that gave no external warrants for morality, a world which was disenchanted, demagicifying. The scientist was no priest. The priestly role was strictly impossible in the disenchanted world that Max Weber described, but the vocation still resembled that of a priest. It required that kind of heroic moral dedication. Now, it's the loss of each of these presumptions that in the course of the 20th century went to the remaking, I want to say, of the scientist's identity. I'm going to be talking largely about the United States, and I'm aware of the parochialism of talking about the United States, but so much of the patterns which were developed and are being developed in America, what can we say, diffuse across the world or infect the rest of the world, but I think it's legitimate to do this anyway. So I'm going to leave now the distant history, 5 minutes or so, and take up a story about the 20th century and about the more recent past and indeed the present. So let's start with the connection between science and technology, or the absence of a connection between science and technology. Now, true, in the 17th century, Francis Bacon urged the utility of reformed science, and he urged that utility was a powerful gauge of the truth. But amongst the civil powers and in the general culture, very few people believed him. And it was not just Max Weber who, into the early 20th century, insisted that the scientist, as a scientist, had nothing to do with useful outcomes. It was a trope which goes back a very long way, that ancient historians and medieval historians are aware of the contrast between the so-called contemplative life of the priest and the disengaged intellectual, and the active civic life of people who are doing things in the public sphere. So it's a kind of a cultural commonplace, and insofar as it was said that the scientists had nothing to do with useful outcomes, that was assimilating the scientist's identity to the contemplative life, and therefore to the life that was recognized from the life of the priest or holy person. And Max Weber said this in 1917 in the face of very substantial realities for a generation or more, that science, academic science, had become massively involved in the chemical and the electrical industries, and that involvement was continued beyond Germany, in Britain and the United States and France and elsewhere. Now there's an anecdote told by the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he told a story because he studied physics in Göttingen in Germany. He told a story about a mathematician in Göttingen in the late 1920s who annually visited the local Technische Hochschule, or Polytechnic. And this was done in Göttingen every year to give a lecture, and the subject of the lecture was the relationship between science and technology. But this mathematician was ill on the occasion, and so a substitute was found from the Göttingen professoriate who agreed to take his place. And as Oppenheimer tells the story, he went to the Technische Hochschule and he said, "Gentlemen, I am asked to speak on the subject of the relationship between science and technology, but I cannot do that, because Sie haben ja gar nichts miteinander zu tun." They have nothing to do with each other, which must have gone down very well at the technical high school. Now, the lesson was that in the late 1920s, there were people who believed that science was one thing and technology was quite another. Now, in wartime Los Alamos, where of course Oppenheimer was the scientific director of the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb, he liked to tell the story. He told it again and again in public lectures and in essays. And the lesson he drew was then more ambiguous. He wanted to say, in the 1950s, for example, that while science and technology fertilized each other, he said, quote, "They differ very much in their motivation, because surely the motive of any scientist, if he is an honest man, is that he wants to understand the world. And the motive of the engineer or the technologist is that he wants to change something about it and make it better. The one, the scientist's role, is aimed at understanding, the other at control." So this is Oppenheimer telling a story about the world before the atomic bomb, after the atomic bomb, where the world had changed substantially. So the notion of the scientist ended where the technologists began, or that pure and applied scientists belonged to different species, survived the end of the Second World War, but only just. So that writing in the scientist journal, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the physicist James Franck explicitly restricted the designation of scientist to, he said, the class of men who devote their lives to free scientific research and who do not take an active interest in the application of the sciences to practical questions. Now we're talking again about the 1950s, after the Second World War. Now, I don't need to tell the story about how it came to be, not only that science was seen to produce technology, but that it was one of the scientists' main purposes to make that happen. This was indeed a story importantly told through the Second World War, through the Manhattan Project, through the Cold War, and through the strenuous politicking that led both to the foundation of the National Science Foundation in America and other national institutions for the support of scientific research, and through the period of the Pentagon's massive support of an intrusion into American scientific life. Now, the second change in the scientist identity is related to this, and it's the routinization of science as a job. During the 20th century, scientists increasingly became people who exchanged their labors for pay. A few commentators deprecated that circumstance. And this deprecation of the idea that science should be a job, again, continues in some quarters through the Second World War and a little bit beyond, so that in 1952, the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky noted that the days of the independent scientist and of independent science are about over. I was a science student in the 1960s, and I was told by one of my teachers that there was someone who was an eminent protozoologist who did not have an academic job or a job of any sort, writing like The Man in the High Castle. And even then, I thought such a thing was impossible. How could one do significant scientific research without being paid to do it? But science had become so folded into political and commercial institutions. The price to be paid for those advantages was a need for popular support and a submission to social control. These are the words of the Columbia geneticist Dobzhansky. So even in the early 1950s, you could regret that state of affairs, which people like me took for granted. And it was a distinguished scientific journalist. This is Dan Greenberg, the great scientific journalist for Science Magazine, the weekly publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who wrote in his book in the late 1960s, science was once a calling. Today it's still a calling for many, but for many others it's simply a living and especially comfortable one. For not only is it relatively affluent, but its traditions of freedom and independence provide a facade behind which government-subsidized liberties may be taken in the name of creativity. Very cynical. But writing from the official organ of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that's the kind of sentiment that you began to hear in the year before the great events of 1968. But those sorts of voices, and the regret that science had become a job and a normal job, became harder and harder to hear through the 1960s and certainly into the 1970s. No longer the independent amateur, scientists were now employees, they were professionals, they were not amateurs. Whether they worked for institutions of higher education or for government or for industry, some scientists delivered, if you like, intellectual goods, others delivered themselves as receptacles of embodied skill that had a market value. Still others increasingly delivered material goods or the resources that were understood as immediately necessary for the production of material goods and services. So writers like the left-wing British crystallographer J.D. Bernal like to refer to scientists as research workers. That wasn't an accidental term that people like Bernal used, a usage which had been routine since the beginning of the century in industrial laboratories, where scientists were routinely referred as workers who did research as opposed to workers who operated machine tools. But that usage became standard amongst left-wing, especially Marxist scientists in the run-up to the Second World War. And the designation of scientists as workers was institutionalized through trade unions like the Association of Scientific Workers, and later through the anti-nuclear weapons NGO, the World Federation of Scientific Workers. An American government report just before World War II also designated research workers and research personnel as valuable assets to the state. In the 1950s, arguing for further integration of science into the economic and political institutions of the state, Bernal made it plain that scientists are just one kind of worker, as necessary as, but not more necessary than any other. So scientists shouldn't think of themselves in any different terms. They were workers, they belonged to the working class, workers with head and hand, so that this is part of a political agenda, but also increasingly represented as describing the realities of what it was to do a job of science in the middle of the 20th century. Now, the transformation of science from a calling to a job bore upon other major 20th century changes in identity, what I'd like to call the moral normalization and cognitive normalization of science. American British educators and politicians were especially vigorous in countering sensibilities that a scientific career required genius, that you had to be an extraordinary sort of person intellectually in order to do a useful job of scientific work, or that scientists were weird sorts of people, or that there were moral heroes. So this was an effort not simply that had a moral dimension, but had an intensely important strategic Cold War dimension, because states like America involved in the Cold War needed more and more of these sorts of people. And so the message went out from writers like the chemist Glenn Seaborg, who was at the time both Chancellor of the University of California and Chair of the American Atomic Energy Commission. The message to young people going around to science fairs was, this is a job that you can do. This is a job that you consider. You don't have to be weird, you don't have to be morally extraordinary, you don't have to be a genius. There is an important job of work to be done. Harvard, the president of Harvard at the time, the chemist James Bryant Conant, also produced much rhetoric of this sort as a tactic in the Cold War, because scientists were the kinds of people that a Cold War state needed a lot of, and that were an asset that had to be, was commonly used, that stockpile in the same way that uranium and plutonium had to be stockpiled. And so that's a kind of both the moral and especially the cognitive normalization of science that began to develop very strongly through the Cold War period. Now, there's another kind of normalization that one really ought to talk about, and that's gender. Because I've been using the word he, constantly, accurately, to refer to the demography of the scientific job, but really as part, not as part of feminism, but as a part of the same Cold War enterprise that this represents. There are some surprisingly vigorous sentiments expressed from these same sort of sources that women should be present in much greater numbers in the scientific career. And so scientific spokespersons, including Seaborg, were increasingly purposefully using, in a way that's much more audible in the 1960s than it is now, gender-neutral terminology to refer to the scientific workforce and explicitly to confront the presence of women. In fact, even in the early 20th century, in the 1910s and 1920s, industrial research managers expressed themselves in print that there was no reason why women should not be more actively recruited into the research laboratories of electrical, photographic, and chemical companies. There was this worry, the practical worry, that they would leave their careers to get married and have babies. But there was active sentiment that there was no cognitive reason, unlike the sentiments expressed by the former president of my university, that women were not cognitively up to it. And so the physicist at Caltech, Lee Dubridge, was one of several American scientists, educators, and policymakers during the Cold War who lamented that the physical sciences and engineering had, he said, almost completely failed to enlist women. And yet, he said, and remember this is the 1960s, psychologists tell us that there is statistically no essential difference between the kind of mental aptitudes found in men and in women. Why are there not just as many female engineers as male, thus doubling our potential supply? So then you get this Cold War stockpile argument. This is not feminism. This is a Cold War argument. Women constituted, in the words of an American scientific administrator in the mid-1960s, I quote, a large part of the greatest unused potential for scientific and engineering labor, and Cold War national interest demanded that steps be taken to release that potential. So in Britain, surveys of requirements for scientific manpower, still manpower, in the late 1950s contained separate chapters on scientific women power. These are UK government reports in the late 1950s, underlying women's potential for expanding the technical workforce and tentatively exploring reasons, rarely including active discrimination, why there were so few female scientists and engineers. By the later decades of the 20th century and into the present, gender has been joined, of course, by concerns about race, ethnicity, and the categories of disability were enshrined in law in countries like the United States. Though by this time, interest has come to center less on maximizing scientific workforce in the post-Cold War world than on ensuring equity issues in the era of identity politics. The scientific workforce should, it's now officially thought, look roughly like the American population as a whole. And that's a sentiment you find in very many American institutions. You expect the categories, the identity categories of the American population to be represented in any particular activity, including science and engineering, as they're represented in the population. So there seems to be a continuity in an opening to moving away from the white male conception of science, but the reasons for that move actually change over a period, especially from the early 20th century through the Cold War and beyond. Now, in the early 1960s, the identification and criticism of the military-industrial complex, this is Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, later rebranded as the military-industrial academic complex, and of big science. The term big science is coined months after Eisenhower gave his address about the military-industrial complex. Figure importantly in the recognition of the civil and military value of science and in worries about its intellectual and moral normalization. So that Eisenhower's farewell address that put the military-industrial complex tag into circulation worried about the undue political influence of scientific experts. He meant Teller and Wernher von Braun. But it's less remembered that the president also worried about the increasing collectivization and organization of scientific research that critics thought was stifling creativity. So you find in the less quoted parts of Eisenhower's address not just the worry that the political process is being subverted by the scientific technocrats, but as science becomes more organized, more integrated into the state and into commerce, it's losing the categories of individual genius. It's actually, you can find, I think the sources for this are in an essay called Signs of the Time by Thomas Carlyle in 1829. And I think there's good evidence that the speechwriter was purposely making that romantic gesture to genius. So months after Eisenhower gives this speech, Alvin Weinberg, who at the time is director of the Atomic Energy Commission's Oak Ridge Laboratory in Tennessee, put the term big science into circulation, and he too expressed anxiety. He was against big science. From the heart of the Atomic Energy Commission, he was against big science. And his anxiety was that the effect of the size of the modern scientific enterprise and its accompanying institutional forms had an effect, a detrimental effect upon the quality and creativity of science. There were more chiefs than Indians, as he unfortunately put it, and scientists were going after grants, not going after breakthrough ideas. He worried, and other people worried at the same time, that science had become mechanical. It was losing its philosophical bite. It was losing its cultural scope, especially amongst Central European emigre scientists in Britain and the United States. That it was becoming less philosophy and more a turning of a handle to produce results that people wanted. Weinberg said that science was becoming, quote, fat and lazy, and that scientists were now, quote, spending money instead of thought. Again, a sentiment you hear very strongly amongst that generation, which is reaching 60s and 70s and 80s or in this period of time in the 60s. The biochemist Erwin Chargaff, the man who did the work on the based ratios that Watson and Crick used to construct a double helical model of DNA. Again, another people at that stage in his career said, the institutionalization of science as a mass occupation, which began during my lifetime, has brought with it the necessity of its continual growth, not because there is so much more to discover, but because there are so many who want to be paid to do it. So that kind of cynicism from the generation passing the stage, a generation which formed a more Central European philosophical conception of science, is a kind of note of regret or lament at the time. Now, although he didn't always follow his own advice, Oppenheimer, I mentioned earlier, reminded his colleagues that skill in physics did not qualify physicists to pronounce on all sorts of intellectual, moral, and political matters. This is in an era at the same time when you're having people like Edward Teller and Wernher von Braun functioning importantly in the White House, giving advice and attempting to form policies central to the Cold War. And Oppenheimer wrote, in reference to, because Oppenheimer fancied himself a classical scholar, he said, the study of physics, and I think my colleagues in the other sciences will let me speak for them too, does not make philosopher kings. It has not until now made kings. It almost never makes fit philosophers, so rarely that they must be counted as exceptions. Of course, he thought that he was one of the exceptions. Not. Later, Oppenheimer was targeted by Michel Foucault as the prime example of the new breed of what Foucault called the specific intellectual, said to be emerging from the Second World War, a figure licensed to pronounce on restricted technical matters but declined to act, this is Foucault's term, as a spokesman for the universe, in other words, the death of the intellectual. Not just the impossibility of the philosopher king, but the death of the intellectual. In that sense, the new scientist's specific intellectual was not an intellectual at all. True, what Foucault reported as a fact about modern arrangements, C.P. Snow in The Two Cultures in 1959 identified as a misunderstanding. So the early pages of C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures asked, why ever were scientists like Ernst Rutherford not regarded as intellectuals? They ought to be, according to Snow. But Snow, in the late 1950s, was fighting a battle that had already been lost. And so the divide between intellectuals and scientists, whether one celebrates it or condemned it, was becoming an accomplished fact. Now, one reflexive result of these changes is that our capacity to know some statistical facts about the scientific life emerges out of this context. As science became a normal part of governmental and commercial activity, so the state put in place bureaucratic processes to find out things about the scientific life, to find out bureaucratically accountable things about the scientific life. How many scientists were there? What kinds? Who were they? Where did they come from? Where did they go? How were they paid? What did they do? The Cold War state needed to know these things. Science was recognized as a strategic asset, as I've said. U.S. government reports after the war, again, referred to scientists as resources to be stockpiled. This is beginning to fade away even before the end of the Cold War. We have too many scientists. But in the era where there was a race against the Soviets and the Chinese, to produce more and more scientists, the state really needed to know these things in order to generate not just more, but the right sorts of scientists. So governments around the world, and this is of course not just in the United States, did their part not only in recruiting scientists into the state apparatus, but in counting scientists and in accounting for them as an exercise of state bureaucracy. Now, measures of the numbers of scientists varied according to different criteria of who was a scientist, but all indices reflect huge growth in the post-war decades. So in 1906, one survey found that there were 4,000 American men of science worthy of note. But by the 1944 edition of the same survey, that number had grown to 34,000. By 1963, a sociologist estimated that there were about 1 million people with scientific and technical degrees in the United States. In 2012, the National Science Foundation Science Indicators said that the number of U.S. workers in science and engineering occupations grew from about 152,000 in 1950 to 5.5 million in 2009. Now it's well over 6 million, which is an average annual growth rate of almost 6%. And 5 times the growth rate of the over 18 total workforce. So talk about normalization. Now, quantitative growth was part of the contemporary consciousness of scientists and administrators, and that growth was also significantly remarked on scientometric studies during the 1960s. And this is one of the most important early scientometric studies. This is, of course, the exponential growth curve from Derrick to Sawyer Price's Little Science, Big Science, 1963, 2 years after both Alvin Weinberg and Eisenhower's remarks. What de Price, and you'll know this, was trying to point out that almost any measure of science, whether it was the number of papers, the number of scientists, the number of scientific discoveries, normal patterns of growth have always been exponential. So on the one hand, he was talking about the historical past, but he was also normalizing a mode of growth that many people had thought belonged peculiarly to the middle and later part of the 20th century. It was in the nature of science. This is the origins of the science of science. It was in the nature of science to grow in this way. And a science of science dealt with the natural laws just like that. So the doubling period for almost all aspects of science, including, as I said, the numbers of scientists, was about 10 to 15 years, whatever it was. Scientific papers, scientific journals, the numbers of scientists. And the point is there had been no moment in the historical past where that had not been the case. So even though you're getting this large growth in the middle of the 20th century, science had always been doubling at about that period of 10, 15 years, or maybe 20, 25 years. It doesn't really matter very much. So that post-World War II scientists and administrators talked agitatedly about the unprecedentedly rapid increase of scientific numbers. But what Price was trying to point out in this, he had always been like that. The only difference was the doubling that was being experienced in the middle of the 20th century was from a higher absolute base. And so Price was offering, interestingly, a historical explanation for why scientists don't think historically. Because 90% of all scientists who were ever alive are alive now. But that had always been the case. 90% of all the scientific literature that had ever been published had been published in the last 10 years. But it had always been like that. So in other words, he's providing a kind of answer to C.P. Snow's question about why scientists have future in their bones. Or put another way, don't care about the past, because the scientists live always in the present in a way that other cultural practices, you want to say, do not. At the same time, Price was asserting that aspects of this normal pattern of change could not escape the logistic growth curve that produced these spectacular increases, because he famously said, If scientific growth continued as it had done for centuries, quote, we should have 2 scientists for every man, woman, child, and dog in the population. Scientific doomsday is therefore less than a century distant when it reaches the saturation limit. Discuss, because a lot of it depends upon a definition of what science is and who a scientist is and what counts as a scientific product. Now, Price wasn't greatly concerned with the different categories of scientific personnel because he was persuaded that all indices of science follow these broad patterns of change of that sort, the exponential curve. But the official statistical exercises of the post-war period reconfigured the idea of a scientist in all sorts of interesting ways. The joined-up notion of R&D, research and development, appeared possibly for the first time in a post-war report to the president. It's not clear exactly how the R&D category became institutionalized, but some scholars of these things refer its emergence to political concerns with linking research and development in a normative way, that they ought to be linked in this way. And R&D was seized on as part of government projects to justify an expansion of support for the former, for scientific research, through widely valued outcomes that were said to come from scientific research. You get this in Vannevar Bush's famous Science, the Endless Frontier, and similar documents. And so what's been called the linear model, whereby pure science produces applied science, produces technology, produces economic growth, became part of a pattern of justification. And the category of R&D was a category that was natural to use as part of that culture. Now, these fairly modern changes in the scientist's identity point to a degree of incoherence, instability, and hybridity. The figure of the modern scientist is, of course, new, but it's not wholly so. It's put aside certain features of past attributions that I sketched at the beginning, but not entirely. And appreciating this sort of hybridity loses a certain sense of clarity about who the scientist is, which is supposed to be my topic. But the hybridity is also important if we're going to speculate at all about what the future might hold. So I want to finish by briefly describing some modern hybridities, or if you like, incoherences about who the modern scientist is and ideas of the scientist's identity. So start with a matter that's of concern to very many administrators, managers, politicians, including university administrators, the figure of the scientist as a business person or as a potential business person. Now, the character of the scientist as engaged in commerce is, of course, not new. In the late 20th century, in the 17th century, again, Francis Bacon argued that the special legitimacy of scientific knowledge geared to the extension of technical and state power was important to what reformed science was. Knowledge is power. Many of the members of the informal Lunar Society of Birmingham in the first industrial revolution in England in the middle of the 18th century were involved both in scientific inquiry and in business. People like Matthew Boulton and James Watt of the steam engine, Josiah Wedgwood, the potter in America in the 18th century. A figure like Benjamin Franklin, again, represents a figure of that sort. And when one moves into the early part of the 20th century, a figure like Fritz Haber of the Haber-Bosch process, professor at the University of Karlsruhe, joining forces with Karl Bosch at BASF to produce a synthetic ammonia, is emblematic of the relationship, intense relationship between science and business, even at a time when Max Weber, in the end of the First World War, is denying that there is any relationship between science and technology. So there's nothing really new about the scientist involvement in business in prior times, even given Weber's stipulation that there was no such thing. This continued into the 1920s. Probably the most important fictional portrayal of a scientist in the United States is the book Arrowsmith by Sinclair Lewis, where there's a tension between the figure of Max Gottlieb, the Central European scientist doing science for its own sake, but joining and having a desperately unhappy experience with a pharmaceutical company, and Mark Arrowsmith's quest for identity. What kind of person was he going to be? Should he be like Max Gottlieb, or should he pursue a life that yielded utilitarian outcomes? So if the involvement of scientists with commercial affairs is nothing very new, what is substantially novel in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century is the widespread notion that the point and purpose of scientific inquiry, the motive for scientists' work, is and ought to be a commercial outcome. This gets institutionalized in all sorts of ways, in ground proposals, in the evaluation of professorial work, and in widespread cultural expectations. The figure of the engineer entrepreneur goes back at least to the Industrial Revolution. The scientist as an employee in high-tech industry at least goes back to the great German chemical firms of the second part of the 19th century. But the scientist as entrepreneur, I think, becomes a recognized figure in the general culture later, only with the rise of startup electronics companies in the post-war period, early Silicon Valley, and especially with the rise of biotech firms in the 1970s, beginning with venture capital finance companies like Genentech in 1976 and Biogen, which is a Harvard spinoff, in 1978. The construction and approval of that figure, the scientist as entrepreneur, is approved and further assisted by the rise of the American University Technology Transfer Office and the identification of the transfer of intellectual property produced by professors, either licensed to for-profit firms or spinning off a company from this intellectual property, really dates from this period of the founding of biotech firms, and politically from the passage of a very interesting piece of American legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act, which mandates that universities that take ownership of intellectual property take steps to license that technology in the for-profit sector and spinning off of companies. Move to 2000. And the sequencing of the human genome then was celebrated as a crowning achievement of scientific organization, and it was offered as a paradigm case of the institutional force fields in which scientists in the future were likely to find themselves and should find themselves. The Genome Project was a hybrid enterprise all the way through. It was advertised as a race between public, which is the government, both the US and the UK and French agencies, and private, which is a commercial and quasi-commercial enterprises. It was advertised as an achievement in pure science and as an enterprise whose ultimate goals involved the cure of diseases, the production of profitable drugs, and the spinning off of a breed of biotech companies to make these things happen in the global marketplace. The knowledge the Genome Project yielded belonged to biological science, but the means used to produce that knowledge were completely dependent upon both the new instrumental technologies of gene sequencing and new forms of organizing scientific and technical work. The private initiative was itself institutionally hybrid, a complex and interlocking fabrication of profit-making organizations and non-profit entities that would license discovered gene sequences to their commercial counterparts. The leader of the American public effort was a devout Christian, the head of the NIH, Francis Collins, and the federal and, of course, non-profit National Institutes of Health
actually took the lead in securing patents on gene sequences, not the commercial outfit, but the government outfit, that angered the leader of the private enterprise, the biologist and atheist J. Craig Venter. And this led to Venter's decision to leave the government, to leave the NIH, and to strike out on his own. And he became a poster boy for commercialized science. So he's not just on the cover of Business Week that you see here, but on the cover of Time magazine. He becomes one of the most widely recognized figures. But this is the scientist as entrepreneur. And you notice in the Business Week thing that's posed, that's sort of Photoshop before Photoshop, posed with a white lab coat on the right side and the businessman's jacket on the left side. And the figure has been reproduced again and again, including the book I wrote on the subject. So he's one of the most instantly recognized figure, and of course he's now written 2 books about himself and his work. But here he's presented as a chimera of science and entrepreneurship, of inquiry and of business. So that's one conception of who the late 20th, early 20th century scientist is, a chimera, a hybrid of identities that were previously reckoned to be incompatible. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, and arguably even long after his death in 1955, you could say, and I think it's true, the iconic scientist, if you ask, as I've asked my students, to summon up an image of the scientist, would probably be this. Backlit, abstracted, disheveled, ascetic, saintly, world-weary, a man whose theoretical researches had something to do with imagining an atomic bomb. He did not work on the atomic bomb, but who, when he heard of the use of the atomic bomb against Hiroshima, could only say in Yiddish, oy vey, woe is me. No single figure, I think, now supplants Einstein as the embodied icon of modern science. But one candidate has to be Craig Venter, a man whose aggressive autobiographies present himself partly as thrusting technological and organizational genius, and partly as a hyper-traditional guardian of the individualism and independence that's long been judged essential to the very idea of science. But it's shifted from the academy as a place of free inquiry to the startup company. The startup company is a place now of free inquiry where people can do what they want and happen, if they're lucky, to have venture capital resources to do what they want. You get almost an inversion of the idea of the place of freedom versus the place of control. Very strongly, not just in Craig Venter's presentation of self, but in other scientists, entrepreneurs. Nevertheless, there is another vivid claimant for present-day status as scientific icon. Because if I ask you, since Einstein is ruled out, to sum up a picture of the scientist, you might summon up this picture. This is, of course, the Cambridge mathematician Stephen Hawking, who's just retired from the Lucasian chair of mathematics, once occupied by Isaac Newton. And here you have a figure where the ancient ascetic idea is literally in front of you, figuratively disembodied, physically barely embodied. A wonderful book by Hélène Millet about the body of Stephen Hawking. Otherworldly, almost ethereal, Stephen Hawking represents the continuing circulation in the 21st century of a scientific persona scarcely altered from the 17th century contemplative ascetic priest of nature. So the figure of the modern scientist is then a work in flux, degree of incoherence, one whose current state testifies to the instability of how we now think of who these people are, and to whom we ascribe enormous potential power. So if Craig Venter represents the leading edge of institutional and cultural change, That leading edge itself represents only a part of contemporary reality. The figure of Venter is offered as an embodiment of the hybridity of the scientist and the technologist, of pure intellectual inquiry and of commercial and civic goals. The new model scientist, it might be said, is like anybody else, only much more so. Presentation of people like Venter as hero. The figure of Hawking represents the present-day limits of that hybridity, because that's a figure instantly recognizable from the distant past. The present inevitably contains bits and pieces of the past, and all I can say about the future is that it's a fair bet the future will too. Thank you.